interject for the time being. Good evening. Thanks everyone for coming. Good. Okay. Can you all hear me? No, it's not even on now. It's off. Hello? Okay. As I said before, good evening. Thanks for coming. This is a great evening we have planned for you tonight. I'm Olivia Madison, and I'm a librarian. And I'm also Dean of the Library here at Iowa State University. And I'd like to thank you for coming this evening to this lecture from our very illustrious colleague, Nancy Pearl, to serve as a highlight to local and national efforts to protect intellectual freedom and the freedom to read here in the United States. This lecture was planned by the University Committee on Lectures to support the National Banned Book Week, which is officially September 23rd through September 30th this year. The University Lectures Committee has a very long history of supporting speakers who underscore the need for our basic freedom to read, and is part of a continuing national effort to protect that basic right. Tonight will be no different. The American Library Association, with its many co-sponsors, has proclaimed next week as what's called Banned Book Week. Its message is more than the freedom to read, freedom to choose, or the freedom to express one's opinion, even if that opinion might prove to be unpopular or unorthodox. In its essential message is the crucial importance of ensuring the availability of those unorthodox or unpopular viewpoints to all who wish to read them. In case you're interested, for the first time, you all can log in to the Banned Books Week website, www.ala.org.bb-books, and vote for your favorite challenged book. So get out there and vote. Do any of you watch the Stephen Colbert report? Sorry. Well, you know, he won the vote for that bridge over in Eastern Europe. And we can do better than Stephen Colbert. So get out and vote for your favorite challenged books. The votes will be tallied and announced on Monday, October 2nd, so stay tuned. There are three top reasons, or what I call my favorite top reasons, for challenging books and why that happens. Typically, it's because a book may be sexually explicit, it could contain offensive language, or considered unsuited to an age group. A book often is challenged but not actually banned. A banned book is one that is actually removed. And these actions do not simply involve a person expressing a point of view. Rather, they are an attempt to remove material from the curriculum or from a library, thereby restricting the access to others. Over dinner tonight, I learned of some other novel ways of trying to stop the availability of books being read, and one of which was new to me, which is having a group of people who will put books on hold to check out, and then they don't show up, and then someone else puts it on hold. So it's continually unavailable, even though it hasn't actually been banned. Another technique is stealing the books, so that it's not just banning them. So there are all sorts of ways that are out there, and they're all ways that we need to be aware of and say and make a point for in our own lives, and as well as supporting those libraries and schools that look to protect our freedom to read. In 2005, the ALA Office for Intellectual Freedom received notice of 405 challenges. For each challenge, there's probably 4 to 5 unreported challenges. So it's still an issue that is important for all of us in this country to be concerned with and support those efforts to keep our right to read. In 2005, the top 3 challenged books were It's Perfectly Normal, and that was challenged mainly for homosexuality, nudity, sex education, religious viewpoint, abortion, and being unsuited to the age group. So that book sort of had it all. Judy Blume's Forever for sexual content and offensive language. and one of the old chestnuts, The Catcher in the Rye. Believe it or not, that was number 3. So J.D. Salinger lives on. Off this year, but have been on the list for many years in the top 5 are Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck and also Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Across this country, books are usually challenged with the best intentions to protect others, frequently children, from difficult ideas and information. However, many years ago, Supreme Court Justice William Brennan in Texas versus Johnson said most eloquently, "If there is a bedrock principle underlining the First Amendment, it is that government may not prohibit the expression of an idea simply because society finds that idea to be offensive or disagreeable." Or as former President Lyndon Baines Johnson wisely said, "Books and ideas are the most effective weapons against intolerance and ignorance." In light of these serious and continuing challenges to our right to read what we want, please keep in mind the simple theme of Banned Book Week. Read banned books. It's your freedom we're talking about. It's now my pleasure to turn the podium over to a new Ames colleague of mine, Art Weeks, who will introduce our speaker tonight. Art is a newly appointed director of the Ames Public Library, and he has had a distinguished career in public libraries, which has showed a clear migration northward with several stops on the way, starting in West Palm Beach, Florida, up to Anchorage, Alaska, but he has wisely come a bit south to Ames. And Art, welcome.
Hope we don't have to go through this again. Can you hear me? Is this okay? G.I. Joe was created by Hasbro in 1964 and was called the world's first action figure. 40 years later, a librarian brought this term back to life in a blue dress, glasses, and comfortable shoes. And with the push of a button, the most enduring symbol of librarianship, the library This evening's speaker is a librarian who simply does what librarians do. That is to match a book to its reader and a reader to its book. What separates her from the rest of us librarians is that she simply does it better than anybody else. Back in 1998, she wondered, what if everybody in Seattle read the same book? By giving Seattle this reading assignment, she began a movement so popular that it spawned the One City, One Book, One State, One Book events that are happening all across America. In 2003, she published a book whereby she made the bold claim that she could recommend a book for every mood, moment, and reason. She delivered on that lofty promise with Book Lust, a book about books that sold over 100,000 copies. In 2005, she had 1,000 new recommendations for us in her follow-up, More Book Lust. The Today Show chose that book as one of their book club selections. And if being an action figure isn't enough, a bluegrass band called the Nancy Pearls made their debut on the rooftop of a library in Sydney, Australia during her tour of libraries down under. Her commentaries on books are heard on National Public Radio. She fills auditoriums across America and abroad, often referred to as the librarian's version of a rock star. The Los Angeles Times put it best when they called her one lusty librarian. It is my honor to present to you Nancy Pearl.
Thank you, Art. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm always reminded when people clap at the beginning of a talk of something Bishop Fulton Sheen once said. Bishop Fulton Sheen once said, when people clap when he comes up to speak, he's sure they clap out of faith and hope. And at the end, he's positive they're clapping out of charity. But it's really an honor to be here, especially to celebrate and help us remember banned books. I've always felt in my long career as a librarian that it's very easy to give lip service to that sort of noble, lofty conception of intellectual freedom, but it's harder to put it into practice. It's really easy to say you believe in that people should have access to all books on all subjects, on all sides of every subject. But what I've discovered is, as one of the best slogans I've ever read says it, there's something in my library to offend everyone. And it wouldn't be a library if that weren't the case. And the problem is when you're, say, selecting books for your library, when you come across a book that really rubs up against one of your strongly held beliefs. And librarians know that the most important thing for them to do at that particular time is to put that book in the library. And that's really when push comes to shove, when it's something that you would not want to read or you don't believe in. And that's why I think that librarians, public librarians, academic librarians, special librarians, really are the keepers of the torch for the First Amendment. And it's something that we continue to do and are proud to do. But even more important than that, I think it's one of the most important things that we do. And I want to talk tonight about my life with books and reading. What that life has been like, the pleasures of a life of reading, and then share with you some of the perils of a life of reading. Because I am a librarian, and it is important, as I learned in library school, when you are building your collection for your library, that you balance that collection, that you don't have just books on just one side of every issue. So I would be very remiss in my career as a librarian if I didn't share with you the perils of a life of reading, because indeed there are some. I was born in Detroit, Michigan, to a lower middle class family in a lower middle class section of Detroit. It was a family that not only did we have no money, but we had no happiness. It was a family that if I were writing a memoir, which I'm never going to do, but if I were writing a memoir, I would, of course, refer to it as a dysfunctional family. But when I was growing up in the 1950s, I'm not sure that word dysfunctional was even in common usage, and certainly no 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old would have used it. What I knew when I was that age was that my house was a particularly awful place to be and not a very safe place to be. So consequently, I spent my childhood at my local public library. It was the Parkman branch of the Detroit Public Library. I would go there every day after school. On Saturdays, I would wake up very early. I would pack my lunch. I would walk or ride my bike to the library. I would be there when the library opened at 9 o'clock, and I would be there still when the library closed at 5:30. And it was a librarian. It was those librarians at that library who would have to tell me that the library was closing, it was time to go home, and frequently they would have to take me home. They would drive me home because they knew that wasn't where I would go if I had the choice when I left the library. And it was those librarians, particularly a librarian named Frances Whitehead, Miss Frances Whitehead, who gave me, I think, one of the greatest gifts that anybody can give another human being, and that is the gift of books and reading. What Miss Whitehead did when she suggested books to me, when she would pull books off the shelves of that Parkman Branch Library's children's department and give them to me to read, was she showed me that there were worlds beyond the world that I knew and ways of living beyond the ways that I saw around me. And I knew when I was 10 years old that I wanted to be a librarian. I wanted to be a children's librarian just like Miss Whitehead. And I was one of those kids who really wanted to do good in the world. And I remember articulating, I remember saying to myself, well, what could I do that would be better in this world than to be a children's librarian and give to another child what Miss Whitehead gave to me? And I did grow up to become a children's librarian, and my first job after library school at the University of Michigan was back in the Detroit Public Library system. And while it would have just been too wonderful for words if I had been able to work at the Parkman Branch Library, I was Miss Whitehead's colleague for a number of years, and that was very, very meaningful to me. That library, my Parkman Branch Library, I always thought was a Carnegie library. And it wasn't until after Book Lust was published that I realized that I learned it was not a Carnegie library. And I write in the introduction to Book Lust about my love of this library, and I describe it as a Carnegie library. And I include in the introduction to Book Lust my email address, and I said, well, I'd love to hear from any readers out there with some suggestions for good books to read. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. But one of the emails that I got had the heading, "Sorry to have to tell you this." Now, it always seems to me if you're so sorry to have to tell somebody something, why you have to tell them that? But nonetheless, this very nice gentleman wrote to me and said he'd done a study of Carnegie libraries, and he was sorry to have to tell me that the Parkman Branch Library was not a Carnegie library. It had been built too late to be a Carnegie library. Well, in my mind, it is still a Carnegie library. And those of you who grew up with Carnegie libraries will recognize the kind of library I'm talking about. It was a library where you walked up some stairs to that center entrance, and Carnegie's libraries always had stairs going up to the front door, because Carnegie believed that you ascended to knowledge, and that walking up those stairs was a metaphor for what took place within the library. And I love that idea. You walk into the library, of course, and the circulation desk is right in front of you, right? And the children's books are to your right, and the grown-up books are to your left. And at that time, never the twain did meet. You had to be 13 years old before you could check out a grown-up book. And I remember when I turned 13, I said to Miss Whitehead, "I'm 13, can I go over there now and check out a book?" And she said very grudgingly, but she was very loath to say this, she said, "Yes, I guess you can." Now, she wasn't grudging because it wasn't any censorship issues for her, but what she was afraid of was that once I crossed that great divide, I would never come back and I would never read all those other children's books that she really wanted me to read. But she walked with me over to that grown-up section, and she introduced me to the librarians over there. And I picked out my first grown-up book to check out, and it was Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, which is many people's first grown-up book. So that library, my Parkman Branch Library, has always been so important to me and played such an important role in my life that I find that I frequently dream about it. It sort of appears, it's the setting for many of, whatever happens in my dreams, it always seems to happen in that library. And I always thought that was a very normal thing to have occur. I mean, doesn't everybody dream about their local childhood library? And then I learned that it wasn't such a normal thing. And the way I learned it was this. Now, I'm one of those people who really doesn't do well in social situations. I'm one of those people who have literally nothing to say except about books and reading. I'm really good about books and reading. As one of my former supervisors once said, she said, "You know, Nancy, every time I say something to you, you always say, 'Oh, that reminds me of a good book.'" So I'm good at that kind of thing. I'm not good at parties. I'm not good at any of that kind of social chit chat. And I just actually am so not good at it that I prefer not to do any of that and tend not to do any social things whatsoever, which gives me a lot of time to read. But one of my last jobs at the Seattle Public Library was I supervised the great children's and teen librarians who did all the hard work of programming for that age group. And at the end of the summer, like many public libraries, the children's department celebrated the end of summer, the summer reading program, and we always celebrated with a breakfast at one of the downtown hotels in Seattle. And because I supervised the people who were putting this on, I was invited to come to that, and I had to go. And it was not something that I looked forward to. I worried about it for a very, very long time. Many nights I stayed up worrying about this, what I was going to say to these people. And I walked in the morning to the breakfast, and they showed me where I was sitting. It was at a round table at the sort of front of the room. And my worst fears were immediately realized. There were seats for 8 people at the table. There were 3 men sitting at the table already, and everybody else who was supposed to be there was off doing social things, talking to other people. But I sat down and said hello to the 3 men who were there. One of them on my left was one of the deputy mayors of Seattle. On my right was this very dashing gentleman who was on the Seattle Public Library's foundation board. He was one of those Seattle people who are always tanned because he spends the wonderful Seattle summers in Seattle and the horrible Seattle winters in Palm Springs. And plus, he's the kind of man, he wears those loafers with tassels on them. And those loafers with tassels, I'm just struck dumb. I mean, even if I was good in social situations, one look at those loafers and I would have nothing to say to that person. So he was on my right. Across from me was a guy named Dennis Bounds, who is one of the newscasters from Seattle, who's Seattle Television, who is always the MC of that summer reading program. And there we are, the 4 of us, sitting down, and they bring the orange juice, they pour the first cups of coffee, and no one is saying anything to anybody. So I feel like I'm like the nominal hostess of that table, so I have to make conversation. So I say what I usually say. I say, "So what's everybody reading?" And that conversation took 3 seconds. It ended after 3 seconds because the answer was the Da Vinci Code, the Da Vinci Code, and the Da Vinci Code. So then silence fell again. And the silence was building up. It was quite a long silence by that time. And when I'm nervous, when I get anxious, I tend to sort of, shift around a lot. And I was sort of shifting around evidently so much that my napkin fell off my lap. And I had to reach down to get my napkin. And this table had these nice white table skirts on them. But they were quite long. It was quite long. So when I reached down to get my napkin, I had to lift up the table skirt and reach, look for my napkin and reach underneath it. And as I did so, I noticed that Dennis Bounds, the guy who was sitting across from me, the television announcer, newscaster, was wearing cowboy boots. So I sat up and I said, "Dennis, great boots." And he said, "Oh, do you know why I wear them?" And I said, "No, why?" And he said, "Because I don't have to match my suits." Well, I was so excited by the level of repartee that we had achieved that I neglected to ask him, did he mean by that he didn't have to sort of match his socks as they came out of the dryer? Think of the time that would save. Or did he mean he could just wear any color socks? Under because the cowboy boots would hide them. I suspect the latter, but who knows? I was so excited I couldn't think. I just was struck dumb. I couldn't think of anything to say. So silence fell again, and it was a very long silence. Now, I bet right about now you're wondering what this has to do with books, but it does. So this very long silence, goes on and on and on, what seems like forever. The main dish comes and goes. They pour more coffee. People are looking around, looking at their wristwatches, wondering when the main part of the breakfast is going to begin. And silence, silence, silence. So finally I say, I dream about my childhood public library fairly frequently. And that gentleman to my right, he of the tan face and those tassely loafers, looked at me with horror in his eyes. And if no one has looked at you with horror, recently, or indeed ever, you don't have to worry. You will know it when you see it. He looked at me with horror, and he said, just like this, he said, "Oh my God, Nancy, get a life!" And I wanted to say to him, but I didn't, because he was a member of the Library Foundation Board, very generous member, and I worked for the library. I wanted to say to him, we are given one life to live in this world. But it's through books and reading that we can have any number of lives. We can go anywhere, we can do anything, we can be anyone. And I knew that that was true when I was 10 years old, and I know that it's true today. And so you can imagine how excited I was when I got a call one day in my office at the library from a guy named Gary Luke, who's the editor at a small Seattle publisher, Sasquatch Books, who said to me, "Nancy, why don't you come down to our office? I want to talk to you about writing a book for us." So I said, "Oh, that sounds interesting." So I went down to the office, their offices, and I said, "What kind of book are you thinking about, Gary?" And he said, "Well, I want you to write a book for us about good books to read." And I said, "Oh, like what kind of thing?" And he said, "Well, what I'm thinking of is that you'll come up with about 200 quirky categories, and in each of those categories you'll put about 350 words, and it'll be 65,000 words, and you'll be done." And I said, "Well, wait a minute, can I put any books in there?" And he said, "Absolutely." I said, "Out of print books? They don't have to be new books?" He said, "Yep." I said, "Children's books?" "Yep." "Nonfiction, fiction, mysteries, westerns, anything?" He said, "Absolutely. You can do anything you want in that book." He said, "I just have 2 requests." I said, "Oh, what are those requests?" And he said, "Well, first of all, I don't want the book to be dull." He said, I want when people read the book, I want them to feel as though you're talking to them about good books to read, about books that you love." And I said, "Oh, well, that's pretty easy, because I would just write it as I would talk." And I said, "What's the other request?" And he said, "I want you to do a section on Civil War fiction." Well, remember, the first grown-up book I read was Gone with the Wind. So that came into my head. I said, "Oh, I could do that section on Civil War fiction, but why do you especially want a section on Civil War fiction, Gary?" And he said, "Oh, I'm looking for a good novel to read about the Civil War, and I figured you could recommend one." So I went home, and I sat down, and I wrote the first section in Booklust, the first section that would be part of Booklust, which was a section not very quirkily called Civil War Fiction. And I used that as a template for everything else that I did in Booklust and more Booklust. One of the things I believe as a librarian, very strongly believe as a librarian, is that, and for our society as a whole, we spend all this time concerned with what's new, that we forget that there are an awful lot of things that were published many years ago that are wonderful still to read, and that any book that someone hasn't read is a new book to them. So for all the quirky sections in Booklust and more Booklust, I wanted to start with the best of the past and come forward to the present. So, of course, with Civil War fiction, you want to start with Gone with the Wind, one of the earliest books written about the Civil War. But I also wanted to include that other classic that you always have to have on hand, especially at the public library on a Wednesday night, when a high school junior races in and says, I have to do a book report on a historical novel, and it's due on Friday. Got anything short? And so you give them, of course, Red Badge of Courage. So I started with those, but then I could include the best novel ever written about the Civil War. If it won the Pulitzer Prize in the 1950s. If you have not read McKinley Cantor's Andersonville, you've got to go right out and get it. It's been out of print for years, but it's back in print. It's if you like historical fiction, don't miss that. It's an amazing, amazing novel. Not always pleasant to read, but it's set in the prison camp, and it's not a beautiful story. But it's a book that everyone should read. So I included that book, and then went on to, I included, of course, Michael Shara's The Killer Angels, and then Charles Frazier's Cold Mountain, and another book that came out almost the same time that Cold Mountain did, but never got the same publicity, and that's a novel by a man named Jeffrey Lent called In the Fall, which is about a Union soldier who marries a runaway slave and takes her back up north to New England, where he lives, and it's the effects of that interracial marriage on the next 3 generations. A wonderful, wonderful novel. And so I finished that section on Civil War fiction. It was about 350 words. And I called Gary. I thought, oh my, this is too much fun. I must be doing something wrong. So I called Gary, and I said, Gary, I'd like to email this to you. Read it. Tell me if this is what you really want. And I sent it to him, and he called back almost immediately. He said, oh, Nancy, this is exactly what I want. He said, 199 more quirky categories to go. And he said, but I can't talk to you now. I'm on my way to Elliott Bay Book Company, which is a wonderful independent bookstore in Seattle. He said, I'm on my way to Elliott Bay to pick up a copy of Andersonville. So I figured I was doing something right. So the next section that I wrote ended up being one of my favorite sections in both Booklust and in More Booklust, and it's a section on great first lines. I think that the first lines of novels are some of the most important lines that you can have in a book, not just novels, any book, because in many cases, that's how we decide whether we're going to go on and read any more of that book. It's whether those first lines grab you. And one of the first lines that I knew that I had to include in that book is the first line of a wonderful novel called The Paper Boy by Pete Dexter. Pete Dexter is one of the great prose stylists, I think, of the 20th and now 21st century. He's a man who can write such strong, active prose that you're just swept into the story, and his characters are 3-dimensional, and they just jump off the page, and they live with you for months and months and months after you finish his books. Now, the trouble with Pete Dexter's books is that those characters that he creates are so grungy that you wouldn't want them in your life for 2 or 3 or 4, for any time after you finish the book. It's hard enough to be in their company while you're reading the book. So I always try to read Pete Dexter's books a little at a time so that they're not so overwhelming. And I decided I would read The Paper Boy when it came out, that I would read it on the bus. Every Monday I would take the bus from the library downtown out to the University of Washington, where I would do my book review section on the public radio station there, and then I would take the bus back downtown and then finish out working that day and then go on home. So I figured 15 minutes there, 15 minutes home, 15 minutes back to the library, once a week. I thought in 3 or 4 months I would have finished the book, and I would have had all those benefits of the wonderful Pete Dexter writing. So I got on the bus with my copy of The Paper Boy, and I sat down and I opened The Paper Boy to the first page, and I read the first line. And the first line of The Paper Boy is, "My brother Ward was once a famous man." Now, it seems to me that's a terrific first line. That's a first line that kind of dares you kind of says to you, I bet you can't stop reading now, because it opens up so many things for you, so many possibilities in the reader's mind. Why is it written in the past tense? What was Ward famous for? What's going on? And so I couldn't stop with just that line. I read to the bottom of the first paragraph, and then I read to the bottom of the first page. And then I noticed that something really, really weird was happening to me. My cheeks were like bright red. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding. I thought I was having like a heart attack and that I was going to faint. And I thought, to faint on the number 71 express bus, there are worse places in Seattle to faint, but that is not the most salubrious one in which to swoon on that bus. And I thought, what is the matter with you, Nancy? And then I realized that what had happened was that I had quite literally fallen in love with this book. And all those physical things that were happening to me were things that happen when you fall in love. So I thought, well, you can't read this book on the bus. You have to take this book home and read it in the privacy of your own home. So I closed the book and I clutched it. Just like the people on the cover of Booklust and More Booklust, I am not those people. I clutched it and I said, wow, this is a book. And the man who was sitting next to me got up so fast and moved as far away from me as he possibly could. But it is, wow, what a book. I mean, it's a book about fathers and sons. It's a book about brothers. It's a book about, let me say, it is a book that is absolutely spectacularly written. It's filled with such grungy people. That you always have with Pete Dexter, you have the good, which is those fabulous writing and those fabulously developed characters, and then you have those characters themselves. So I knew I had to include that first line. But when you're going to do a selection of first lines and you're talking about you want to start with a classic, I had lots of choices for what classic I would include. Call Me Ishmael, Happy Families Are All Alike. But I knew that I wanted to include the first line of a book that many of us were assigned, again, when we were in high school. And some of us, well, I'll just speak for myself, never got much beyond that first line. Do you know what book it was? Yes. The Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Plus, I wanted to include that because there was a wonderful, when I was writing that category, there was a wonderful cartoon in the New Yorker that had Charles Dickens sitting across from his editor, and the editor is saying to him, "But Mr. Dickens, you must make up your mind. It surely can't have been both the best of times and the worst of times." But then I could go on and include such wonderful first lines. There's an amazing first novel by a woman from Ithaca, New York, named Rian Ellis, and the book is called Afterlife. And the first line of that book is, "First, I had to get his body into the boat." And then there's a novel that is perfect for anybody. I think any female from age 12 to 112. And it's by Dodie Smith called I Capture the Castle. And the first line of that I think is perfect for any writer. The first line of that is, "I write this sitting in the kitchen sink." Now, don't you wonder what she was, why she did that? Then there's the first line of another first novel by a guy named John Griesemer, and it's called No One Thinks of Greenland. Now, this is just being made into a movie, and nobody has read, very few people, I've never run into anybody who has actually read No One Thinks of Greenland except for me. But now it's being made into a movie, so I'm hoping other people will read it. But the first line of No One Thinks of Greenland is, "You'll want to scratch," said the nurse. "Don't," said the orderly. And then I could include my very favorite first line, the first line of a novel called The Towers of Trebizond by a British writer named Rose Macaulay. And Rose Macaulay loved three things in her life. She loved travel. And The Towers of Trebizond is a story of a car trip that a group of British travelers are taking in Turkey. Trebizond is the name of the ancient name of a region of Turkey. So the book is really a novel in the form of a travelogue, and it's absolutely very, very funny, as you'll see from the first line. But the other two things that Rose Macaulay really loved, she loved animals and she loved the Anglican Church. And in this first line, she got everything into that. And I think this would be a great assignment in any creative writing class. Write down your 3 favorite things and then come up with a first line of a novel that incorporates all those things. So the first line of The Towers of Trebizond is, "Take my camel, dear," said my Aunt Dot, as she climbed down from this animal on her return from high mass. And then it goes on from there. It's a wackily wonderful, wonderful book. So I finished that section, and I finished 173 more sections after those two, and finished up with about 175 categories, about 1,800 of my favorite books. There are books in Booklust that I read when I was 10 years old and younger, Space Cadet by Robert Heinlein being one of those, and books that were published as late as April of 2003, which was the last minute that Gary would let me add any books into the manuscript. And so Booklust was published, and I know there are writers in the audience, and you know how exciting it is when you have a book published. And this was especially meaningful to me because I had included in Booklist every single book that I had read and loved for my whole life. And that joy, that elation of having written a book lasted for about 3 months after the book came out. Almost like a month after the book came out, several things started happening, sort of simultaneously. In the middle of the night, I would find myself coming awake at 3 o'clock in the morning every night, and I would nudge my husband. I'd say, Joe, wake up. And he would say, huh. And I'd say, did I include Anthony Trollope in this book? And he'd say, I don't know. So he'd say, I don't know. So I'd have to get out of bed, go to the other room, turn on the computer, check in the manuscript. I discovered to my horror I had left out Anthony Trollope, whose books I love. I discovered on subsequent nights I had omitted one of my favorite armchair travel writers, a guy named Bill Bryson. If you have not read Notes from a Small Island, that is just, and you need a good laugh in your life, it's a wonderful book. I had left out the first line of one of my favorite novels, a novel by Anita Bruckner. The book is called The Debut, and the first line of The Debut is, and all of you readers will appreciate this, Dr. Weiss knew at 40 that her life had been ruined by literature. So I was coming, every night there was another book or another author that I realized I had somehow omitted from Booklust. And then I started going out on this book tour, and everywhere I went, when I would do readings and talks, I would ask for questions, and there would always be several questions from people, and they would be asked in tones varying from simple curiosity to downright hostility. But the questions would be, why hadn't I included their favorite author? And then the emails started coming in. Now, innocently, I had said, I'd love to hear from people. Let me know what you're reading, what I've left out, because I thought, I would hear from like 6 or 7 people, and I could compile a reading list because I thought my life would be pretty empty after this book was done, and I would need some more suggestions for books to read. Well, the emails started coming in thick and fast, and they would say things. They would all have that heading. They say, the heading would be Booklust. And then it would say, they would all start the same way. Dear Nancy, loved Booklust, but trust you've never heard of. And then they would list 200 books. And some of those were books that indeed I hadn't heard of, and would dutifully look up every one of them and start reading them to see if I liked them. So that was great. But there were books in that list of 200, of course, that I had read but hadn't liked as much as the writer of the email had. So that was fine. I had no guilt about that. But then there were books that I had loved but had just forgotten to include when I was writing those particular sections. And so all of that excitement and elation and happiness about having written Book Lust was rapidly turning to regret and guilt and sorrow. And so when I was in New York on this book tour, Gary called me and said, "Nancy, what would you think about doing another Book Lust book?" And I said, "Oh, Gary, I'd love to do that. Could we call it Book Lust 2, The Morning After?" And Gary said, "Oh, Nancy, great title. Well, I could have said, could we call it the Da Vinci Code 7? And he would have, or Make Way for Ducklings 11. And he would have said, "Oh, great title. Because in the end, they named it, for reasons of their own, for marketing reasons of their own, More Book Lust, which I think is such a boring title. And if you agree that it's a boring title, I would be happy to share Gary's email address with you, because we're still fighting that battle. But More Book Lust gave me the opportunity to rectify all of those errors that I had made in Book Lust. It isn't a sequel. It isn't an updating. It's really a true companion of Book Lust. And there's a wonderful Nancy Griffith song, I think, the country, sort of alt country singer, and where she talks about true companions of the road. And I think that Book Lust and More Book Lust, I like to think that they're those true companions. And I have this sort of vision that on people's home library shelves, there'll be Book Lust at one end and More Book Lust at the other end, sort of book holding them together, bookending them. And I thought with Book Lust and More Book Lust, there's about 3,000 books that I've loved over a lifetime of which I've spent doing nothing but reading. And I couldn't imagine that there was an author that had meant something to me that I had left out. And then I was in Sydney, Australia at the Sydney Writers' Festival last year, and I had just finished doing a session, and I was walking down George Street, which is the main street in kind of old downtown Sydney. And this woman grabbed me as I was walking by her. And she said, "Are you Nancy Pearl?" I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Well, where's William Maxwell?" And I thought, oh, William Maxwell. He was the great New Yorker editor for the New Yorker, fiction editor for New Yorker, wonderful novelist. I thought, I didn't include William Maxwell? He wrote this great novel called The Folded Leaf. This was all going through my head. And I said, oh, William Maxwell to her. And then to try to make her feel better, this was Australia. I said, well, I did include that section on all those great Australian writers. And she said pshaw, sort of like spit. Psh. She said, Australian writer. Psh. She said, William Maxwell, why didn't you include him in either book? So I realized that I am never going to ever include everybody that I've loved. But I have to say, if you're looking for good books to read, here are 3,000 really good books to read in Book Lust and More Book Lust. And for me, the pleasures of reading have been really too numerous. If it weren't for reading, I wouldn't be here tonight. First of all, there wouldn't be an action figure that I got to be the model for. All of that is due to the pleasures of reading. But I did tell you that I would share with you some of the perils of a life of reading. And the perils are serious. I want you to take this seriously. If you're thinking of spending a lot of time reading, I want you to be aware of some of these perils of a life devoted to reading. One of those perils occurs especially if you learned your vocabulary from books that you read rather than hearing the words. You never know how to pronounce anything. I cannot tell you how recently it was that I learned that the word segue, which is, of course, segue, is not pronounced segui. There was this moment on the radio when I was just about to say, Sagui, which would not have been good. Luckily for me, or somewhat luckily for me, I worked with somebody very early in my career as a librarian. He used to always sit in the front row of any place where I did a talk, and whenever I mispronounced a word, she would helpfully shout out the correct pronunciation. So I learned that F-U-G-U-E was not Fagui. When things go wrong, they always go Ari, right? Awry, of course. And then there's the word that everyone, I believe, that many people in the world, not everyone, but many people have been misled into pronouncing the wrong way. And that word is, of course, mizzled. How do you pronounce M-I-S-L-E-D? Mizzled. Mizzled. Gore Vidal somewhere writes in one of his journals that all his life he has pronounced that word mizzled. And he says not only has no one ever corrected him, but no one has ever misunderstood him. So, mispronunciations, if you're like me, many people will say to you, well, you read so much. How come you never know how to pronounce anything? And I always say I have a reading vocabulary and not a speaking vocabulary. So give that answer to people who ask you that same question. So that's one peril. You never can pronounce anything. Another peril of a life of reading is that frequently when you're involved in a book, you don't want to, I'll just speak for myself. When I'm involved in a book that I'm really enjoying and I run across a word that I'm not sure exactly what it means, I'm too lazy to get up and to take the dictionary down and to look up the real definition of the word. And I'm always sure that I can get the word from its context. Famous last words. The context. Context is not all. I remember when I was 10 years old and I was reading the Anne of Green Gables books, and there is a scene in Anne of the Island where Anne, one of Anne's best friends, Ruby Gillis, is dying. And there's this, Anne goes to visit her. Ruby is on her deathbed, and Anne has always been jealous of Ruby. She's the most beautiful of Anne's friends, and she has long black hair. And Anne goes to see her as she's dying. And Anne leaves, and there's the sentence that Ruby is dying. And Anne thinks, Anne learns that Ruby has died of consumption. And I'm reading that line, and I'm crying and thinking, well, who ate her? I mean, it gives a whole new meaning to like galloping consumption, like, eating on the run. And then there's a problem, the major peril of a life of reading, and I think, I've thought long and hard about balancing this with the pleasures of a life of reading. The major peril of a life of reading is that, in fact, you never know if your memories are really your memories or if you've borrowed them from a book that you've read. My youngest daughter, Katie, is a freelance theater director, and she travels around a lot, and we talk on the phone nearly every day, and we always talk about only the most important things. And one day I was talking to her, and I said, Katie, did I ever tell you about the dress I wore to my junior prom? And she said, you went to your junior prom? And I said, well, yes, I did. I went with someone named Mike. And she said, oh, well, what was your dress like? I said, oh, Katie, it was just beautiful. I said it was very pale green, and it had a tulle skirt. Now, in years past, I would, of course, pronounce that Tully. And no doubt would have also said I was the belly of the ball. I said it had a tulle skirt and a peplum bodice. And Katie said, oh, well, what's peplum? And I said, oh, I said, I'm not quite sure what it means, but I think it has to do with, like, pipe cleaners or something. So then there was this long silence on the phone. Now, Katie, because she travels so much, she doesn't have an apartment anywhere. or a home anywhere. So everything is over her cell phone. And you know, with cell phones, you always get disconnected. You always, all those dropped calls. And so the silence went on for so long that I was sure we had been disconnected. So I said, "Katie, are you there?" And back came this voice, I mean, in the kindest possible tone. Katie said, "Oh, Mommy, I don't think that was your dress." I said, "Well, whose dress was it?" And she said, "Well, if I'm not mistaken, it was Penny Howard's dress in Rosamond Dujardin's Double Date." She said, "Don't you remember her twin sister Pam wore the same dress in yellow?" Well, it's embarrassing to admit, but I own the book Double Date. It's on the shelf in my living room. And I went and looked it up, and Katie was right. Not only was that Penny's dress, but she went to the prom with Mike, whom she later married in Double Wedding after breaking up for a little bit in Double Feature. All three of which I own. Well, I know I didn't marry a Mike. I mean, I'm clear on that. I married a Joe. But other than that, it has now thrown my whole past into disarray. I mean, I have no idea what went on during those 4 years of high school. And I don't know what to believe. And I don't know what to think. And another thing that I'm just sort of dealing with, which is like and making me just very disturbed, is that I have this very, very distinct memory that at Christmas time, every year, my mother, my father, my sister, and I would take turns. Every year, one of us would get to choose what color the Christmas tree was decorated in. So one year it was like all in white decorations. One year it was all in red decorations. Well, I'm Jewish. So I somehow doubt that ever really occurred. But I keep sort of telling people that in the hopes that someone will have read a children's book, because I know it must have come from that, in which that happens. And will come up and say, no, Nancy, that wasn't your life. It's in blah, blah, blah by blah, blah, blah. But given those perils, and there are a few other perils, but those are the major perils, balanced against the pleasures of a life of reading, who would not opt for the pleasures of a life of reading? And before I take questions, I just want to share with you a short paragraph about the pleasures of a life of reading by Virginia Woolf. And this comes from an essay by Virginia Woolf called How Should One Read a Book? In a collection called The Second Common Reader. And if you haven't read this essay, I really commend it to you to read, because it just speaks to readers everywhere. And in it, she's talking about reading being a joy and a gift and a pleasure in and of itself. And she concludes the essay with this paragraph. And I love this paragraph, and I concluded the introduction to Book Lust with this paragraph, because I love the picture that I get in my mind every time I read this paragraph. And this is what she says. I have sometimes dreamt that when the day of judgment dawns and the great conquerors and lawyers and statesmen come to receive their rewards, their crowns, their laurels, their names carved indelibly upon imperishable marble, the Almighty will turn to Peter and will say, not without a certain envy, when he sees us coming with our books under our arms, look, these need no reward. We have nothing to give them here. They have loved reading. Thank you. Any questions? Yes. Oh, yes, and then.
When you were a child, who
Oh, when I was a child, who did I most want to be with the people that I read about? Mostly I wanted to be in a happy family. So any of those families, Beezus and Ramona, any of those. There's a book called, let's see, by Sidney Taylor. All of a Kind. Thank you. All of a Kind Family, where the family was so poor, but they were so happy. So what I read to escape, and I sort of read to imagine myself in the lives of those families. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I'm amazed at how you keep track of authors, titles, characters. Do you do that for all your books?
I have nothing else in my head except books. And it's like a parlor trick in a way. For some reason, it's pretty easy for me to remember books that I care about, which are the books that I talk about, are books that stay with me. Yeah. Yes.
Right now in Des Moines, in a high school, there is a controversy about putting on the play The Laramie Project, which is not a book, but it's a play, and so it has words in it. And I'm always amazed when I read the people who want to ban this play, not have the high school put it on, because what offends them is the language. That's first, and under that is the idea of a homosexual agenda, but not the idea that a person was brutally murdered,
Right.
which seems odd to me. What is it in your mind, since you know a lot about ban books, what is in the banner's mind first and foremost? Is it a fear of sexual content?
I think that what's behind any request, any dislike of a book that goes to that extent where you want to take that book out of circulation is fear. I think it's fear. I think it's fear that in some way that book will corrupt the reader into thinking differently from how you would want them to think or to feel. And I think that's one of the great dangers that's occurring in our society these days, is that we're so increasingly polarized that there's no way. It's very hard for people on different sides to come together for the good of anything. And so I think that fear is a very powerful motivator, and one that in a way we would welcome, because it should be a way that we can discuss it and we can use those books for good discussions. I mean, I don't think it's any surprise that many of the challenged books have been books that communities have chosen for discussion purposes, for these one book, one community discussions. One of the most chosen books is Ray Bradbury's, Fahrenheit 451. And when we were choosing books in Seattle, we would always choose a book that really spoke to some very strong human emotions or human experiences that we need to talk about. I was struck many years ago. Of course, Alan Drury wrote his really good, interesting novel to read, Advise and Consent, about the U.S. Senate. And if you read that book today, and it's a really good story still. I mean, Alan Drury, went off the deep end after he wrote Advise and Consent. But in Advise and Consent, what's so interesting to read today, when you read it today, is the description of the way the Senate works back in the 1950s, when it was civil, when you had people who disagreed with one another but talked it through for the good of the country. And you compare that to what's happening today, where there's no discussion and seemingly no commonness at all. It's like we're living in a different world, a very scary world. Yes?
Can you give me your thoughts about what do you think about books and the films that are made from the books?
Yes.
To me, it looks like films frequently are somehow competing for the audience. People see the film and then really don't think they should read the book. And there's so much more to the book And there's a film I watched Thank You for Smoking, and I'm currently reading Thank You for Smoking.
Yeah.
And it's more fun.
Right.
I mean, there's more humor in the book than there could be put in the movie, even though I really like the movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The question is about the comparison of film versus the books that the films were based on. And I think that there are two parts to that. One is, as you say, that the books are frequently much deeper and even much funnier. I mean, there's much more to the book than you're able to put into this hour-and-a-half movie. But I think more importantly, what a film does is set in celluloid, if they're still done in celluloid, or digitally now, what the main character looks like. You know, once you see the film, you can't get that picture out of your head. So what's really what makes me a little sad is that before the Harry Potter books were filmed, every individual reader conjured up their own Harry Potter, their own Ron Weasley, their own Hermione. Now when people read the book and see the film, that is the Harry Potter that they'll see. Now maybe they did a great job of casting Daniel Radcliffe as Harry Potter. I mean, I don't think that takes away from that discussion. One of the joys of reading is that the reader and the author are in cahoots. And in many ways, the reader is helping the author write the book. And every reader writes a different book with that author. And in the film, it's not that way. It's in your face in a much different way than the book is. However, there is one film that I thought was better than the book. And it's an old film. It's based on a book called The Philadelphians by Richard Powell. And the movie is The Young Philadelphians with a very young Paul Newman. And the movie was much better because it killed off. It didn't include one of the characters, and there were like one too many women in the book. But the movie made it just much tighter and nicer.
Of course, there are films which have taken very inferior books and
Yes.
made it wonderful, like Forsyth Saga.
Yes.
Is my favorite example.
Yeah. Yes. And then there are books like, my current favorite book is Little Big Man by Thomas Berger, which if you haven't read and you need another historical novel, Little Big Man, which I don't think I included in Booklust or More Booklust, because I hadn't read it when I was writing those books, is just a wonderful, wonderful novel set just after the Civil War. And I think it is, in fact, a great American novel, capital G, capital A, and should be read along with Huck Finn when you're talking about questions of national identity and race and self-identity. But that was made into, I understand because I haven't seen it yet, an equally good movie. Yes. Yes.
I recommend you try and rent that movie. Dustin Hoffman
Yeah.
plays the Little Big Man, and Faye Dunaway plays his mother. It's a delight.
Yeah.
movie.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to that. Yes.
You always read every book you start, and if you stop the book, at what point?
Yes, do I always read, do I always finish every book I start? And if I don't, at what point do I stop? No. I think that it's a huge mistake to read a book that you're not enjoying, no matter whether it won the Pulitzer Prize or your best friend says you have to read this book, I absolutely loved it, whatever reason, except if it's for your book club or if it's a school assignment. Those, I guess, you should read all the way through. But I think reading should be for pleasure. I think that, I'm not opposing pleasure to what I call recreational learning, because I think anything that you read is something that you learn from too, fiction and nonfiction. But I don't believe you should slog through a book to the end wondering why you're reading that book. And I think that people would always say to me, I probably start 12 books for every book I finish. I'm just ruthless now with not finishing a book. I think that 95% of why we like a book is probably the mood that we're in when we read it. And your moods change. And so if I don't like a book, I know that I can go back to it and try it again if my mood's changed. So I always say, if you don't, if you're 50 years, people always say, well, how many pages should I read before I give up on a book? And so I came up with my rule of 50, which is actually on a Starbucks cup. If you go into Starbucks and get cup number 169 in the tall, the grande, I guess it is, or that size, it's on that cup, on cup 169, Nancy Pearl's rule of 50. If you're 50 years of age and under, you should give a book 50 pages. And at the bottom of page 50, ask yourself, am I really liking this book? And if you are, then go on and read it. That's great. If at the bottom of page 50 you're not enjoying it, you're a little bored, you're wondering, who cares, then close the book, put it on your bookshelf, return it to the library, lend it to a friend, wait until your mood changes. If all you care about at the bottom of page 50 is who married whom or who killed, who the murderer was, turn to the last page. As far as I know, there is no way that our government knows whether we finished a book or not. If it's not on the last page, read the penultimate last page, the penultimate page, or the antepenultimate page, or read the last chapter. But don't read all that intervening stuff if all you care about is what happens. That's useless. Now, when you're over 50, time is really short. And the world of books is really, really large. So what you need to do is subtract your age from 100, and that number, which goes down every year, right, is the number of pages that you should read before you give up on a book. Now, as far as I know, except for maybe, the Association for Retired People, AARP, or that you get maybe discount tickets at the movies, nothing rewards us in this world for getting old except my rule of 50. Because when you turn 100, you can finally judge a book by its cover. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much.
We have 3,000 books to suggest to you right over here in Book Lust and More Book Lust, and I believe Nancy will be signing those. Yes. Oh, yes. And then there will be over here some refreshments for you. So after you've bought your book and had it signed, join us over here for some punch and refreshments. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Nancy Pearl. It's been a terrific evening.